Today I'm here with Briell Decker, who has a long history with the FLDS Church. The FLDS Church is a break-off church from the church I was raised in. I was raised in the mainstream Mormon church, but the FLDS Church broke off from the Mormon Church around the time when the Mormon Church outlawed polygamy. So the FLDS Church still practices polygamy today in Utah. Brielle Decker was raised in this church, and she has a long history with it. Today we're going to get into her upbringing in the church, how she was at one point married to the infamous and horrible person Warren Jeffs, who had many underage brides. How many total?
I don't know how many underage ones specifically, but probably around 10 at least.
By the time Warren Jeffs was caught, he had 79 wives, and he is now in prison serving a lifetime sentence. Brielle, I would love if you would just give a quick introduction, and then we're going to jump into what your childhood was like being raised in the FLDS church.
I'm obviously Briell Decker. My elevator pitch is usually like, I was the 65th wife of Warren Jeffs and have since been instrumental in acquiring his house and turning it into a recovery center.
Describe what it was like for you growing up in your family, both from what your family kind of setup was like and just your upbringing in the FLDS church in general.
Okay, so I usually start with like my parents a little bit, just briefly. Okay. I wanted to mention that my parents were an arranged marriage. They were pulled aside at church and told there was going to be a wedding and it was going to be their wedding and they could say yes or no at the ceremony, but they had never met each other. I think my mother had heard of him before, but she had never met him. So she didn't really know if she should say yes or no. It just became a matter of trust in the leaders, and she didn't have a reason at that time to say no, so she said yes. I was born as their 11th child of 14.
Wow. How old were they when they got married?
I believe they were like 20 and 18 or something, 20 and 19, I think.
Was she then his first wife?
Yes.
And was that his only?
No, my father got a second wife when I was about 13 years old, and it was her niece.
Okay.
And she was like the same age as my brother, who was like her 7th child or something.
Wow.
So yeah, it was crazy. Yeah. I liked my other brother better, but that was just because of my long history in my family.
And what was it like growing up as the 11th child with so many children around?
Well, a lot of it, like, they were all from my mother. My second mother never had any children. So for me, it wasn't that hard because like most of them were grown by the time I was born.
Okay.
So it was like I was the 11th child, but like my oldest sister and brother were working by the time I was in first grade. I didn't see him a whole lot. I remember I loved my oldest sister quite a bit. She did help at the school for a time, and then she got married when I was in first grade, and so did my brother. That was an arranged marriage also, but yeah.
So as you were kind of growing up within Short Creek, were there moments where you started to recognize that your family structure and what you were being raised with was kind of different than the outside world?
We had a lot of indoctrination, so it was very common in the doctrine to tell us that we were different. We had a birthright. We were better than them. I didn't believe that necessarily, but I didn't dare tell anyone. I felt like, what would it be like to not have this birthright? I remember having questions like that even as a child. Because I was born in Salt Lake, like Sandy, Utah, which is kind of like more like Salt Lake area. At that time, it wasn't a compound really. You had to go to the Alta Academy to make it a compound, where all the people in the FLDS church that were in that area were scattered all over the valley. So our house was like kind of secluded. It was built by my father. It had a lot of pine trees around the edges that had grown by the time I was a child. He had it pretty private at our house. We didn't get to associate with the neighbors most of the time. So we just stayed in our little yard and played with each other. And when we did go to the stores, when we drove to school and stuff, we saw people out our car windows. It wasn't unfamiliar to see somebody who wasn't in the church.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I've talked to a lot of FLDS people who were born and raised in Short Creek, and that was really until maybe for the men, they go off and do the child labor. That's kind of their first interface with the world. I've never talked to somebody who was raised FLDS, but also smack dab in the middle of modern civilization or just non-FLDS people. What would you kind of think about as you would be driving past people or maybe see them in the grocery store? How did you perceive the outside world?
So that was big for me. And it did save my life later because, like, as a child, I remember questioning. I remember thinking, they don't act like they tell me they are. They're after us. They want to, and they didn't act like that. They were nice to us. They would be like, oh, we like your hair, and smile at us. So I didn't believe what the church was telling me because they didn't act that way. So yeah, and I did remember seeing like people that had different shades of skin and stuff, and I was just like, I don't know why we have to be so mean to them, because in the church they were very racist. The polygamy groups especially are all racist still to this day. The Mormon mainstream church is kind of accepted. People, they said now is the time. They never apologized for what they claim is their history, but they said now we accept them. Years ago, but the polygamy group's not one of them has done. So it's still really racist. So like for me, when I saw people with different shades of skin, I didn't believe it. I was like, they're still nice. They're not what the church is telling me. Awesome.
Yeah. It seems like the FLDS are so much more wrapped up in the early teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and Brigham Young has so many really horrible racist teachings, like if you have an interracial marriage, you should kill yourself, essentially, to basically pay for your sins. So it does seem that if you're going off of not just Brigham Young and Joseph Smith's teachings about polygamy, but also about race, that is going to be an ultra racist comprehension of anyone other than very, very white people.
Yeah, that's what I was raised with. Yeah. And Warren Jeffs is very racist. Like extremely racist, and he thinks like things like, he added things into the doctrine, obviously, where like, music that has rap was created by a bad spirit because it was from race, it was created by people that were of a different shade of skin. It's just of the devil. Stuff like that is pretty extreme. I think so.
As you kind of are growing up, did you eventually move to Short Creek, or how?
Yes.
What was, to explain that process of going from Salt Lake and then moving to Short Creek?
So the Jeffs moved first. They moved like 2.5 years before everyone else left the Salt Lake Valley. I think he did it to combine everyone in that compound because it was easier to watch them and stuff. We moved out of the Salt Lake Valley when I turned 16. He is the reason because the Olympics were coming to the Salt Lake Valley, and God nobody asked the FLDS if they could come to the Salt Lake Valley. So God didn't approve it, and so he said we all needed to leave. And he was really extreme about that too. He would say things like it's a sin to remember your childhood home and stuff. So even at 16, I remember fighting those like memories and stuff. It was just really harsh. Since I left the church, I have been back to my childhood home with like the people in there. Let us go tour it again. But like before that, I literally believed what I was told. Home is where a priesthood is. Home is where the prophet is. They have a big difference between mainstream Mormonism and FLDS, more than just polygamy. One of the biggest differences is family is not as valued. In the mainstream Mormon church, that's like, eternal families, but like in the FLDS, it is everything belongs to God. The children are the gods. The children are the prophets. You can separate them. You can take them apart and tell you who's worthy, who's not. All of that is a different interpretation, like an extreme difference.
Yeah, it seems from what I understand of the teachings, it's much more about the individual and how they are standing with God and how they're standing with the prophet, and families can kind of be broken up, mixed and matched together. Kids can go with different families.
As long as they're under the prophet. Yeah, and God.
Yeah, under the direction of the prophet. Which, did you experience any of that as the change from Salt Lake to Short Creek was happening?
So for me, Brielle was still the prophet when that change happened. For me, when I was 16, moving with my family. It wasn't until like September before I turned 18 years old that Warren Jeffs became the leader. And so he was already extreme in his doctrine, but he didn't have the power to enforce it. That's one difference also between the people raised in Salt Lake who went to the school that Warren Jeffs was the principal of. Because Academy is the school he was the principal of, and that's where the Jeffs were most of the time. So if you talk to people that are from Short Creek and raised in Short Creek, they usually say that when Warren Jeffs showed up, it was an extreme difference. Like it changed the church. Well, for us, it wasn't that. extreme because we were raised around it. It still changed, but like we already were privy to know that that was what was supposed to be, supposedly. So even when he became the leader, it wasn't really a shock to me because he had primed us as children. He told us like stories of the history of the church and how God chooses the leader and not the people, stuff like that. So it wasn't really a shock to me that he was going to usurp authority. I already figured he would. Where all the people in Short Creek were kind of blindsided by that. They hadn't been put in his school and raised as a child to think that that was what was going to happen.
And when the shift from Rulon Jeffs to Warren Jeffs was going on, what, I guess, if you could give kind of a synopsis of how that happened and then what your experience was like in all of that.
Well, like I said, I was already figuring that was going to happen. I didn't know exactly because he always taught us, extreme doctrines like, his father was never going to die and we should pray. But like in the back of my mind, I didn't really believe that extreme. I always had my reservations and my questions that I didn't tell anyone because that's how my biological father was. He kind of taught me to have critical thinking. He would pause whenever they'd ask him to do things and he'd say, can I pray over that and stuff like that. And he wouldn't fight them on it, but it taught me to do that also. He'd still probably do it, but he'd just do it in his way. He couldn't always get out of it, but he did try and he'd think about how he could navigate it a better way and stuff. So they allowed him to pray over it and stuff like that. So that's what taught me critical thinking. That was my first introduction to critical thinking as a child. But really young, I had some of that. My mother isn't like that at all. She's very believe everything. She probably wouldn't say, because she's still in the church too. My father's out. He got kicked out a week after I escaped. My mother probably wouldn't, even to this day, agree with me that she knew Warren Jeffs was going to be the next leader because she was so believing that she thought, that Reuben was never going to die and we should have faith for that. But for me, I was just like, that's not realistic. I didn't know how it was going to go over as far as like how they were going to change that. And when he did take over, he said he was renewed. He just renewed through death and stuff, which I didn't know that was going to happen. But, that's how he did it.
So interesting. Like it seems like you knew the writing was on the wall, but you weren't quite able to fully connect how the pieces would fall into place. And for anyone who's watching, just so you know, Brielle has her 4-month-old with her. So if you hear any small sounds, that's what you're hearing. So thank you, especially to Brielle, for doing the interview while you're also caring for your baby. I really appreciate it. I guess before we go into the Rulon Jeffs to Warren Jeffs change and you moving to Salt Lake, are there any other really standout moments from your upbringing, like big memories that feel important to share?
Well, there's one. I had a traumatic experience right when I turned 8 years old, and that's a big deal in the church. Like you would get that probably too, because when you turn 8 years old, you get baptized. And baptism in the Mormon church kind of means, I don't know about Mormon especially, but I know like FLDS, it was the day that God starts atoning for you.
Yes, similar.
And then you have to kind of atone for yourself. I don't know exactly because I was so young. I don't know when it happened, but I was touched inappropriately by my brother, who was older than me. He was just barely older than me. So he's kind of in his curious stage. I was 8, he was like 12. There's no juvenile system in these churches. That it's just extreme. Judged as an adult at 8 years old.
Wow.
That's how, especially the FLDS is. So when it happened, my mother didn't dare take the blame because my brother had already been caught with my older sister. She couldn't take the blame at that point because, like, if it's the first offense, it's a little bit lighter. But don't do this. It could be a problem. But it wasn't a first offense. It was like a second offense. And so she was one watching us, and she already knew about it. So it wasn't like it was a sister or somebody who didn't know. So she couldn't take the blame for it because if she did, she could lose us all as children.
Oh my God.
Because that's what the FLDS does really commonly, because they're arranged marriages. They will take the families apart and give them to somebody else. So she always tried to blame father for it because he's the priesthood bearer. He should have known, but he was at work. So it doesn't really make sense. But she had us come down and apologize to her and all this stuff. And I'm just like, I don't get it because I'm like a victim. Why do I need to apologize for something that happened, to me?
Yeah.
I was really young, but I remember being really offended by that. I'm the one that tattled on him when I went in to talk to my father and her. My father was really nice to me. My mother, I asked her if God was going to forgive me because as a child, that was the only thing on my mind. Because I had heard so much about God growing up, and she said, you're going to have to ask him. And so I was like, that doesn't give me any hope. That's crazy. So even at that time, I didn't have all the words for it, but I remember feeling like there's something wrong with my mother. And because of that experience, I don't feel like we bonded. She always felt guilt whenever she would look at me. She kind of had this association attitude toward me, which wasn't going to work. So it changed my life cycle. Also, the brother and the sister that had already been caught were there. Both of them were there. My little sister was there at the time when I was pulled in. She was only 6. So she wasn't ever like judged very harshly because she wasn't even at the age of accountability. Oh. I don't know if it was my birthday. I know I was framed because I believe that my brother and sister, when they got caught, because what happened is like I kind of confronted them because like my older sister told me he's not going to stop. And so I confronted him and I saw how angry he was. And I think it's because when he got caught, this is how my adult version of this is. When he got caught, he was confronted by my parents. My sister told me that like when they got caught the first time, the neighbors were the ones that caught him and called my parents over and told them. And they weren't in the church. Wow. They weren't in our church. But they saw him outside. So they called my parents, had him come over. And I remember my parents walking home from the neighbor's house. So I knew it happened, because they never went over there. And then this one day they went over there and wouldn't tell us what they said. When my sister told me that's what they said, I was like, oh, that makes sense. So I went and confronted my brother, figured out how angry he was. And now as an adult, I'm looking back at it thinking like, well, he was so angry because he had already been told he would never be forgiven because he was 12. You know, it's like crazy. So he brought me in to take the blame, I think, to frame me. Because I had barely turned 18. I don't know if it was my birthday or if it was when I got baptized. But I know it was around the time I got baptized. When I confronted him, I took my little sister with me because I was like worried about her. Oh. I don't know why I did that, but I just remember taking her hand and walking in there and confronting him. And because I was worried about it coming back. When I saw his face, he was so angry that I just kind of like hesitated. I told him like I felt bad for him in that moment. I don't know why I felt that bad, but like, I feel like that was a protection because like if I would have just like yelled at him, he wouldn't have took it good. If I would have begged him not to do it, he's not going to stop over that. You know what I mean? But what happened is I took the blame. I kind of just said, let's do it again. Oh. And he said, you're going to be the one that takes the blame because you said that. He didn't know that I knew that he had already been caught. So I didn't really take the blame. But in my mind at the time, my process was like, my little sister's right here. I should take the blame for her so she can be protected. That's so horrible. So I kind of stopped. I believe that was God's protection over me. Oh, okay. Because he didn't come back. He never came back. And it also helped him because he's only 12 at the time. And, you know, that's a better situation than carrying it on till you're older. So he stopped. But I was bullied basically my whole life. They were worried all the time. It changed my life. So that's why I bring it up, is because it changed my life. I didn't realize it as a child that it was going to change my life. I always wanted their approval. They were older than me. I always wanted to do things creative and be accepted and stuff, but it was just never going to happen. At that time, I didn't know that it was probably never going to happen. Now in my life, they both have left the church. I have met with my sister a few times and just kind of talked a little bit over. She's had a really hard life. She just left the church a few years ago, so she's just finding out about all her medical conditions and stuff that, you know, happened because she was judged as an adult at 10. You know, she was in between us. You know, all that stuff took a really big toll on her, more than me. So, because she was in the church for like almost 10 years more than me. Wow. She raised her little girls in the church. So, like, I don't want to go into her story too much, but I just wanted to say, like, they're having a Christmas party this year. First Christmas party with my biological family with this many members. We actually haven't had like very many Christmases at all with them, you know, like, because like the thing is it's just too complicated with the past trauma. But this year they're really fighting for it. And they also said that we can't talk about our past. That's the agreement, because they just want to build new memories. But the person who's hosting it is the brother who did this, and also the brother that locked me up in the end. He actually did name his oldest daughter after my old name, Lynette Warner, when he grew up. I believe he was a target because of all that to Warren Jeffs, because, you know, later I married Warren Jeffs. So like that's why he locked me up. He was threatened, I believe. I don't really hold a lot of anger toward him, but I haven't really sat down and ever done anything with him since he left the church. Wow. So this is a big step for us, just to create new memories and, you know, not hold so much anger, hopefully. My father's going to be there. My brother that I do get along with really well. My little brothers, you know, they're all going to be there. So that will be interesting. Yeah, it did change my life. I just have to, I've grown up now. I know coping strategies. I can't backtrack. They can't backtrack. This is how it is.
I'm sure it's so hard to hold these competing or disparate ideas in your head of wanting to love your family and be close and love your sister and your brother, and but then also have these ultra painful abusive memories that you, no matter how good the future is, there's it's always going to be there. And I know from talking to another person who kind of specializes in talking to learning FLDS stories, that she basically said that she's never met an FLDS person who's left the church who hasn't dealt with some form of child sexual abuse. And I don't know if that's the case for sure. That's just her kind of recounting. But did you know if that happened to your brother, which then kind of taught him the behavior, which he then did? Or have you ever learned anything like that?
I did come back, like after I married Warren Jeffs, there was a time when they sent me back to investigate my family. I didn't really dive into it very deep, but I did find out some stuff because I was just living with them. I wasn't trying to investigate them. I didn't take their, I just used it as a way to escape pretty much. When I did get there, one of my sisters did tell me it did happen in the generation before. Like I said, they're all older siblings, but I don't know who it was or what. She didn't go into detail. She just said, I just want you to know this happened before.
That's so horrible.
So I don't know if he was part of the before or what, because there's like quite a few siblings before us.
Yeah.
So I don't know the rest of the story.
Well, I'm so sorry that happened to you. It's so despicable, and it seems like it's one of those situations where secrecy breeds abuse, and then if you're trying to come forward and say, hey, this is happening to me, then there's all this shame around the sin and the blame of it all, and it's like nothing ever seems like it gets solved because it goes straight back into secrecy.
Because they wanna like say you're the black sheep of the family when you go in to talk about healing. You know what I mean? But like in my case, I think it's a little bit like easier for all of us because there was multiple people involved. I think in a case where there was only 2 people involved, I think that would be a lot harder to prove, a lot harder to get like people on board. Yet it's still necessary because like if they're an offender, sometimes they will reoffend.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of dive in, and it's hard to dive in because you do get shame for it and black sheep of the family. But like I was done when I left the church. I was just like, I'm gonna do my own thing. Like my family, by the time I left the church, they were all against me, and that was because of Warren Jeffs. He targeted my family because he was so mad at me for not agreeing with him. And I think part of the reason why I didn't agree with the child brides and all that is because of this experience. If I didn't have this experience in my past, I don't think it would have been a red flag as big.
Yeah, it's crazy to be told, like, you're so special, we're living under this covenant, we're the chosen people, and then to have this abusive experience and to feel like what your lived experience is so different from what you're being told is supposed to be life under this beautiful doctrine.
For me, I think the church complicates the problem. Not only the secrecy, but like, the no juvenile, judge as adults, the mother not wanting to take. That's why I talk about it too, is because the mother was not able to take the blame, worried she'd lose us all. That all just complicates the whole situation. If they would have had just a regular system out here in the world where they're like, okay, there's a juvenile system, if we want to like address it in home, see if it stops first, or whatever, you know what I mean? But it wouldn't have been what it was.
Yeah, even just, it's crazy that the reason that they even knew about the first offense was because non-members, the neighbors, were willing to go up to their door and knock, say, we have something to tell you. And that's the only reason the first case was even uncovered, was because of neighbors, not because of your family finding or saying anything about it.
Well, I did tattle the second time.
Yeah, true. Yeah, yes.
But the reason why I tattled the second time is because my mother came to me and said, if this ever happens to you, then you need to tell me. But she wasn't the one that caught it. So in my mind, I didn't catch it right off the bat. It was like, went on for a little bit of time, and then I remembered her saying that. So I just, as a child, I was like, okay, I'm going to go tell.
That's so
crazy.
Because
she told me to do. When I remembered that memory, I was like, let's go tell.
It's crazy that she's just like, hey, if this, like, instead of like truly protecting you from your brother, she's like, hey, this might happen to you. Let me know. Like, That's so crazy that that's the coping mechanism, is to just say to your 8-year-old, "Hey, if this ever happens to you," versus just fixing the source or separating the children.
Yeah, there's more deep, like, because she had 14 children. She raised like 9 of my nieces and nephews. I feel like she has some kind of, something that's never been diagnosed. So I don't know. It was like definitely a case of neglect, but I don't know all the details. And I have like since told her that if my nieces and nephews come out with these same symptoms, then we'll have to prosecute because you can't be around kids, obviously. And so they did tighten up. My nephew told me like things changed a lot when that happened. She was more scared of me than weren't Jess. It was really crazy.
Yeah, I think you have a lot of compassion for your family, which is, I'm sure, after years of reflection, I'm sure you've arrived. Like, I feel like I would have such a hard time having compassion, but then when you really look, like you were saying, at your mother's situation, how could she not have problems that have,
I think she did love me. I figure she always treated me like she had disassociated, but like she wanted to be there. I could tell she really wanted to overcome that, but it was just basically impossible for her.
So she personally was pregnant with 14 children.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And then she raised 9 of my nieces and nephews because my brother, in his situation, my oldest brother was given a bipolar wife that would never take her medicine. So she was toxic for the kids, and he had 9 children with her because she was the first wife. He didn't think he'd ever get another wife. And it was just the whole thing is so messed up to even think that he was given a bipolar wife for his first wife. Like that's just kind of abusive.
Then the woman, instead of getting help for her mental health issues, concerns, is instead just impregnated 9 times.
They did try to give her medical help.
Okay.
It's very severe.
Oh, yeah, it seems like it's all so tangled up that you almost can't unwind who's to blame, who gets compassion, who are you angry at. It's all just...
It was like that even in the church. Yeah, I didn't realize how bad it was until I went into Warren Jeff's family. Then he was so angry at me that he kind of capitalized on all my childhood experiences. And so that's when I had to step back and think about it more, because I never thought about it before that. Really, I just had kind of a basic life, after my brother stopped doing that to me. I didn't really register that it was that serious until my brain started growing, like more developed. They say sometimes your brain doesn't fully develop until you're 26. So even though I was 18 when I went into Warren Joe's family, that's pretty darn young to go into like that type of heightened abuse.
How were you, what was the process by which you were chosen to be one of his wives?
So he decided all the marriages, and he kind of groomed us too. Like in his doctrine, he'd say like, God will give you the best if you leave the choice to him. That's actually a quote that he had. Stuff like that was taught us as children. When I was 14, I went and visited my sister who was married to Rulon, and I stayed at his house, Rulon's house, with her for a week. And at that time, nobody said anything, but like when I married Warren, then a lot of his family told me when I went and stayed at Rulon's house, they knew I was going into Warren's family at that time. I was only 14 when that happened.
So he was kind of scoping you out.
Yeah, they said that. So he was basically grooming me. I was scared because I knew I didn't have what it takes to be loved in his family very much. A lot of that has to do with heritage. So like they have the pyramid. I already knew a lot about, more than the most members of his family knew about his family. And that was because of being in Salt Lake where his family was, and also like my sister going into his family. Heritage was a big deal to him.
What about your heritage was not acceptable?
So he likes like more brainwashed people basically, but he said it was more educated people in the church ways.
Okay.
So it was basically if you have 7 generations of parents and grandparents in the church. So on my mother's side was converts. When she was 4 years old, they joined the church. On my father's side, it was a broken chain. My grandmother was the one that had the most heritage, but my grandparents were both kicked out of the church when I was like 13. There were a lot of things that happened when I was 13. We got my second mother. We also had my sister went into Rulon's family. It was a big year for us. Also, my grandparents were kicked out of the church. We didn't really know our grandparents because they always kind of struggled on my father's side. We knew my grandparents on my mother's side really well. But my grandparents on my father's side, they always watched TV even when they were told not to, stuff like that. So we weren't really allowed to go over there much. A lot of that, I think, was my mother's strictness. My father probably wanted us to, but he didn't have all the say. So he couldn't fight for it, I guess, because they weren't as strict.
Okay.
And then eventually they got kicked out of the church. And so he called us in his room and told us that they had been.
So essentially, basically, if there are FLDS families who have histories of certain people getting kicked out or not being righteous, the people who stay in the church are seen as less valiant or something like that.
Less valuable.
Okay. And so when you were 14 and you went to stay with your sister at Rulon Jeff's home, did you meet Warren Jeffs then or like have closer interactions with him?
Yeah. I don't know what age I was when Rulon had his stroke, but I think I was like 9 or something. I was pretty young. So they say in the history, if you watch FLDS history, Warren kind of took over at that time.
Okay.
Kind of. I don't remember before that. I don't have any memories of when Rulon was actually in charge. When I went down there at 14, Rulon was there, but like Warren was next to him at the meals and stuff like that.
Was that when you had more close-up interactions where you started to get the feeling you might be part of his family?
I was teased basically my whole life. And I don't think that was always a factor. But it happened like when I was 8 years old, that trauma experience and being bullied in my family. So what it did create, why it changed my life so much, wasn't just the factors outside of me. It was because I didn't dare disobey the rules of the church because I always had the fear inside of me that I was going to be kicked out by the bullies if I did anything, even if they talked me into it and proved that I did it. I was just terrified. So basically, I was an overachiever. I always wanted to follow the rules. And then they used that against me. So that's how they used it against me. They'd just say, she wants to marry Warren Jeffs. Look at her. She wants to do what's right. And so that kept me in the church, but like it was still working against me. So probably by the time that, I don't remember before it, like that was one of my core memories. Unfortunately, when I turned 8 years old, I don't remember a lot before I turned 8 years old. I remember little clips of little things that were positive, but like, it's kind of like when my brain kicked in, starting to fight for myself and stuff. So around 8 years old, at least, I think is when I started getting teased about being in Warren Jeffs' family later. And it's because of the way I was acting. I wasn't acting that way because I wanted to act that way. And that was the thing a lot of people didn't understand. All the people, all the children are being peer pressured in my school, all the people in my family, my little brothers and sisters, all just believed them. And I couldn't defend myself and say, like, that's not really the case because that would go against me because he was the prophet. So now if it was like a guy they were teasing me about in the church, then I probably could have fought that. But because it was the prophet, it was supposed to be an honor to marry him. I couldn't really fight it.
So you went to Rulon's home when you were 14. What happened after that when it comes to marrying Warren?
So he became the leader like September when I was 17. And my father was a big believer in school. He was also a big believer in turning his children in when they were like 18. So when Rulon was the prophet, he had a little more say over when his daughters got married. When Warren became the prophet, then Warren would call the fathers and put them in like a really catch-22 situation and tell them, your daughter is ready to get married. It didn't matter what their age was, you know, if they're 12. But the difference is that when he did that to the fathers, it made so that they had to decide if they wanted to lose all their children in one day, if they said no to the prophet. Because he said, God told me your daughter's ready. Or if they want to just lose the one.
That is so horrible.
I know. So my father luckily only had me and my little sister, and then he had 2 boys. So my sister was 16. She did get married. In Utah, it's legal as far as like with parental consent at 16. Luckily, she wasn't younger because Warren was doing that. But like for me, I turned 18 in November that year. I got married in January.
Okay.
So I was over the age of 18. I believe it did go in my favor because of the trauma and stuff after I was able to process a little better. I don't think that it was super easy because like I did turn on him for what he was doing in Texas without an exit route against my sister and things that were already in that family. Because she married Warren after Rulon died. Before I did. She married him in November. Stuff like that was really, really hard. I didn't know if I'd survive. I fought for 6 years to find an exit route, pretty much, that I could leave and, you know, never come back. I was in Texas without an exit route, so I had to work my way back to Short Creek. I had to use like Warren Jeffs interpretations against himself. It was very difficult because he's like a master manipulator. And he also didn't want me to escape because I knew too much about him. He's afraid of the world finding out. He had everything in the name of God. So like all his followers wanted God involved, which was a benefit for me because then I could use like his doctrine against himself and get opportunities, work my way back to Short Creek. And then from there, I did work my way out of the church. If you watch my documentary, which is on HBO Max, it talks about like one time, the very first time I did escape. Pretty far, I got to the police station, but I didn't feel safe because they wanted to put me in the shelter next door. And I felt like it was too close to the South Dakota compound. And I couldn't even explain it to them. It was so heightened of a case. I didn't dare talk to them. I didn't know them. That was part of the problem. But the other problem is that I didn't feel like they would understand how, they would just try to convince me that their shelter was safe.
Okay.
But for me, I'm like, the compound is too close. It's like tons of people there, and I just don't feel safe there. I just ended up coming back to Short Creek at the time. It doesn't say that in the documentary. It says I went back. That's all they knew. But what I did was come back to Short Creek.
For anyone who wants to watch her documentary, I will put it in the links below. And to backtrack a tiny bit, could you just share the story of the day you married Warren Jeffs?
So the day I married Warren Jeffs was January 9th. I can't remember the year. I always forget the year. I think it's close to 20 years ago. I was teaching school at the time because I tried to go to high school longer, but they asked me to teach school because I went as long as I could. They didn't have school longer for the high schoolers. They just wanted me to teach school that year. Okay. So my father approved that. He wanted me to go to school really bad, but they didn't have any more grades that I could attend. It was a homeschool. Definitely, I only went to homeschool my whole life. Some of the people in Short Creek, if you listen to their stories, they will say they went to public school for a time. I never did because I was in Sandy and all that. All the schools I went to were homeschool. So even if I went to 12th grade, I would have had to go to GED to get honored by the state. I was teaching school and I had a party that day. I came home when I was cooking. It was late. It was like 10 o'clock at night. I was still cooking. I heard somebody walk in the room behind me because I was chopping the vegetables up. And I heard my mother scream, no. And she was in the back of me. And I turned around and my father was there with a red face. So they had already kind of had their nervous feelings about this too because they already knew how my sister was treated in their family. And they already wondered, I believe they wondered if I was going to go to Orange's family. And Father told me now that he's out of the church, he told me he was worried about that, but he didn't even dare express that to me because he would lose his family. You know, he's the prophet. My mother screamed no. I turned around and my father had a red face and he was like, let's go on a drive. And that was really common at that time when Warren Jeffs became the prophet. Before that, it wasn't so common. They had like a few people that were able to go to the wedding. But at this time, in Warren Jeffs' time, when he was running from the law, he was taking him away with just his father, and they would never come back. My mother was never invited. I did go out with my father immediately. I didn't dare question the whole situation. I didn't get my wedding dress, even though I had one. I just went straight out there. We got in the car, and my father was crying the whole way, bringing me out there. When we got there, he didn't know who I was going to marry at that time. They were just nervous. So the first place they went, they escorted us to another place because he was running from the law. So they had him in hiding. I didn't register that until after the ceremony that he was running from the law. He wasn't on the most wanted list yet, but he was still running from the law. But he kind of brought that up himself. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a big deal. I went in there and the whole ceremony thing was really secretive. He had to have 3 witnesses. So he called in 2 of his brothers. She had one of them do the ceremony. My father was there, the other witness, because that's just the doctrine. You have to have 3 witnesses. He didn't call my mother and have her come. He had his brother come in, which is crazy. But they had the ceremony. Well, first, before that, it kind of goes into a little part of my story where the doctrine played into it, really, and the grooming played into it, where he decided that I was going to marry him. And he asked me, he kind of put it on my shoulders, which I was afraid he was going to do because of how serious my case was. I'd been teased about him my whole life and stuff. I just was worried. And I also had premonitions. I believe in God still. But like I had these dreams where I would wake up and Warren Jeffs was sitting in a darkly lit room. As a child, I'd even have these dreams. And I'd wake up thinking it was the devil because he wasn't the prophet at that time. And he would turn to me and he'd say, who do you think you're supposed to marry? And I would always wake up at a cult one. And it never got to what was actually decided because he was the one that decides all the weddings. But in my mind, I remember thinking, that's the devil. That's the devil. I'd pray him away. I'd just be like, this is horrible, and I'd always worry that was going to actually happen. Well, that is what happened. He turned to me and he said, it was a darkly lit room. He said, who do you want? He was the prophet right before I turned 18 years old. And he said, who do you think you're supposed to marry? And I remember thinking, I just turned away and I said, I wondered if I was supposed to go in the family with my sister that had already gone into his family. And the reason why I said that is because the doctrine was so intense. There was no way out of that question. Like, if he groomed me, if I lied to him, he's going to punish me. That was the doctrine. If I asked for him, that's also kind of a catch-22. There was really no way out of that question. It felt like, standing on the edge of a cliff and which way do you want to jump off? It was no way, there was no turning around. I remember thinking, I wondered if I was supposed to go into that family. He said, you're right. You have a strong testimony of God, which I never saw in my dreams. So he put me in that box because he's kind of a coward, I think, or he doesn't really even live his own doctrine. He doesn't even try, but nobody knows that but the people that are right next to him. Like most people he puts on his fake show. He knows what his doctrine says. My parents' interpretation of him was a lot different than what actually he is like, which was a big shock to me. But I did get both sides of it because I was in his family. He put me in that box. I responded that way. He said it was right, and then he just went right into the ceremony. He never asked me if that's what I wanted.
Okay, wow.
He said, what is God want me to do? And then he's like, yeah, you're right. I was like, well, I don't know if I want to know God wants, you know what I mean? He didn't ask me that. And I still think that's weird, but.
Did you have to do like was it kind of like a Mormon temple ceremony where you do patriarchal grip and all of that stuff, or is it, okay.
But it wasn't in a temple or anything because they don't believe in that. So many temples, but they say like, if there's no temples, then we can make it work anyway with the priest did. He kind of showed me the grip, and he is, his 65th wedding, my first. After the ceremony, he got really angry at me for hesitating to get on his lap when he was 15. I was scared a little bit, and he didn't care about that. He was just angry about that because it's 65th wedding and my first, and I was like, this is a really big imbalance. But he had no mercy, and like the whole doctrine in the FLDS is that you're supposed to have mercy, especially after marriage. So that was my first red flag after the wedding. I'm like, you're not going to have any love when you demand all the other men in the church have love and separate families over not having love after marriage, and you don't have love after marriage. You see what I'm saying?
So why didn't he?
He doesn't live his own doctrine. Okay. He doesn't think he needs to. He doesn't think like he can get in trouble because like their doctrine also is that God would kill him before he'd allow him to lead the people astray. And so that's why the FLDS keep justifying and finding reasons why he would do what he does, and why, it couldn't be true that he's in prison for the real reason and all that, because he hides it from them. I believe I've heard a rumor that the girl who had a baby with him at 15, who was charged in the court case with DNA evidence and everything, there was a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. That girl, I believe that a lot of members are telling me that she's married to one of his sons now or something.
Oh, wow.
He's totally trying to say DNA isn't accurate. But I know she was in the room the day that I had the introduction. So I know that child is really his. He's trying to show the people that it was just the DNA isn't accurate. It was his son's child, and it's just so close to his or whatever. Wow. So he's trying to cover his tracks, but he still did it.
So basically, there was no consummation of the wedding after the wedding.
I never did, but I was also 18, and he's a pedophile. So
yeah, which I'm sure is like the silver lining a bit. Did he ever attempt to, or?
He never did. One time he did touch me. He did in the introduction with other people in the room. He did have us. I go into that in my documentary. So he did touch me. He did see me, but like he never took off his clothes.
And what is the introduction?
The introduction in the documentary, it talks about like when he first started in Texas, where he had a gate in a guard tower and all that, when he first introduced the orgy, ritualistic abuse. He didn't do that in Short Creek, where everybody could talk to their families and have exit routes. He did it where people didn't have an exit route. And also part of the problem is that he tricked us too. When he started that, he didn't tell us there was underage brides in the room. He had us like stay focused on him. He brought like 5 people in the room. So it's in the documentary. I don't like to talk about it very much because it's so dark. And also they did a pretty good job of explaining it.
Okay.
And I don't really want to have different edits all over on that same experience.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, it's a pretty traumatic experience. And because of my childhood experience of already having to deal with some of that stuff, I knew it was changing my life by that time, at least subconsciously. And I was like, this, it's going to work. It was really hard to escape from that. It was so hard. When I turned on him in Texas, I did it like subtly, like my father had taught me. I didn't boldly. I believe I was the only wife who didn't get brought back in.
And just to kind of give background for anyone who's listening, essentially Warren Jeffs, and you can help add to this explanation, but basically Warren Jeffs was in Salt Lake. He went to Short Creek for a time, but then he decided to take the most faithful followers to the Yearning for Zion Ranch, the YFZ Ranch,
Right.
And kind of slowly over time was bringing certain individuals, the most righteous individuals, from Short Creek to Texas, which further alienated them. And that's kind of where the huge situation comes in, where the FBI broke in. I don't know if it was the FBI or CIA. The law enforcement broke in and started to break up the entire compound, correct?
Well, they broke in like later after he was caught already.
Okay.
They got the evidence at that time to keep him.
When were you brought to Texas?
I was brought into Texas like when I was probably 19. Actually, I was brought in 2 weeks after, and then I went back to Short Creek for a short time. When he left, took his whole family away from Short Creek, he brought me back to Texas, and that's when the introduction happened. So I'd say I was probably either 18 still or 19 when I was in the introduction.
Okay. And what was it like for you?
So the first time I went to the Yearning for Zion Ranch, it was just trailers. There was no houses built yet. It was muddy. They had just started it. It took a time to build the first house, and then I left. They had it fast, though. The FLDS built pretty fast. Yeah. So there's a big part of my story where after the ceremony, before he took me to Texas, he told me a story in a secret meeting about when he took his children away from the Dream Center property. He told me that God revealed that not one of the birth mothers, the mothers that had given birth, could go with the children at that time because they weren't worthy.
Okay.
So they got to go at some point, but they just weren't allowed to go when their first children were first taken away from them. So that was really hard on me. That's why I actually went into Texas, is because I had already seen red flags, like I said, on the first day. But I was like, what is going on with those kids? Yeah. So I actually did go into Texas within 2 weeks after. It was so hard for me there because I had already questioned Warren Jeffs. So I was trying to reach God somehow without Warren Jeffs. I was trying to figure out a different route than what he was telling me to do because of some of the red flags that I had seen in those first few days. I still believed in God at that time, their God. When I went into Texas, then I did see that the mothers were getting rotated. The caretakers they hadn't given birth, but they were still being rotated. Okay. So it was really concerning to me because I knew bonding was a big deal. Yeah. And in adoption, you have the hope of bonding. In this case, there was really no hope of that. Just fully cutting the children off from any single caretaker. Yeah. So if they did bond with the one that was on them that day, there was a good chance that they wouldn't be on them again. You know what I mean? Yeah. That is part of pedophilia. Pedophilia, they don't want the children to bond because then they'll tattle on them. Ugh, that's so horrible. So that was a horrible thing. And in foster care now, I didn't know at the time, but they tried to reunite if at all possible. Where in this situation, they weren't even trying. Did they even know at that point whose child was with which biological mother, or did they just completely remove any? They knew before that. They knew before he became a prophet. Okay. Before he became the prophet, they all knew who their mother was. And then when he became the prophet and he started the Yearning for Zion Ranch and said that he's going to take the elite people, the people that are worthy, who are living all the doctrine, God will tell me who they are and I'll select them one by one. He also did some pretty horrible things with taking the kids and separating them from their birth mothers. So then as you first are in the Yearning for Zion Ranch, how long were you there and what happened while you were there? So I was only there for 4 months, but for me, I just stayed in the closets, read a lot, prayed a lot. Because he was telling me to just listen to him and pray. I'm like, well, obviously it doesn't work. Because he's correcting people every single day. That was part of if you watch the Netflix documentary that I'm not in, it talks a little bit about a meeting that Warren Jeffs was in Short Creek. It was January 10th of the same year that I married him. And I did go to that meeting too. So that was a public meeting. And then I went to the Cedar Creek meeting after that where he talked about the children. Okay. In the public meeting, he walked down the aisles and he gave corrections to prominent people who sat on the church. This was the day after I married him. And I was like, if you hadn't requested, because he told my father to make sure I was there, I was like, if he hadn't requested me be here, I probably would have been a little bit okay with that. But because he requested I come to this meeting and see this the day after I married him, that's not persuasion through love. That was how they worded it in the doctrine, was persuasion through love. You're supposed to have steps of kindness, especially after marriage. But he didn't have any of that. He was like saying there's no hope on the day after I got married.
Wow.
So for me, I just wanted to take a different route. So I did. I went to Texas. I studied a lot, just read the doctrine myself, and I hid in the closets from him because I didn't really feel like I was attracted to him either. And I didn't really know a lot about like real marriage education. So like if you talk about my childhood experience when my brother pulled me in, he didn't take off his clothes either. Wow. So like Warren Jeffs never took off his clothes, and then my mother had a complicated relationship with me, so I never got sex education. I didn't even know it hurt, the first time and stuff like that until after I left the church. Wow. So like it was a hard route for me because like some of the abuse that happened in Warren Jeffs' family, I didn't know if I was causing it. For like 8 years I was in this family. I was blaming myself.
Yeah.
I was blaming myself to a high level because I didn't have the education I needed. I actually couldn't even get on the internet. I didn't have any books.
Yeah.
I was in Warren Jeffs' family. So like when I left the church at like, I was 26, that was one of the first things I did is find internet, and go educate myself a little bit. Wow. But like when I did that, you imagine like 26 years old, that's pretty old. Yeah. I should have probably learned a little bit before I turned 18.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can't imagine. I feel like it's one of the craziest there's so many ironies and so many crazy things about the FLDS, but how wild is it that you're in a polygamist sect that is based in sex and based in making babies and having as many wives as you can, and yet basically no one seems to have any education at all about what sex is.
Yeah, they're not really encouraged to teach them.
Even just the idea, not that you didn't even have access to the internet, but you didn't even have access to books. Like there's literally no way to know anything.
Yeah, and then you think about like being abused on top of that, like so high, and the gaslighting is so easy for them. They also don't tell you things like the brain doesn't fully develop until you're 26. Wow. In some people, they don't say things like that. They say totally opposite. They say, God revealed that the children mature faster in our group than other places, which is totally bizarre. But like they say things like that. So like it's totally misleading. And then you think about the wives that haven't ever had kids. How many of them are in the same boat I was, where they don't really realize it hurts and that, all that stuff. I don't know. But like not all of his wives have had kids. Most of them haven't, especially the ones that married him that were older. So I can't say that he never had kids with one of Ruland's wives, but it's very rare. So like Ruland's wives were obviously over 18 by the time they married Warren, so he wasn't really as attracted to them.
Oh, that's so horrible.
Yeah, I know it is, but I'm just saying like it's really traumatic.
Yeah.
And I want to talk a little bit about like ritualistic, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Because like, not the whole experience, but like I just know some basic concepts. Because you hear about like the Diddy thing and all that stuff, and everybody's accusing each other and stuff. And for years, I've told people like some basic concepts, but I just want to highlight them. Where like basically in a group that has adults, peer pressure is always going to be a factor. All these adults, peer pressure is huge, and even if they didn't threaten you, they threatened you by not doing anything. So when you hear like so and so did this and so and so did that, and so it's just all a the blanket statement is who suffers the most in a group when everybody feels like they're doing what they're doing for self-preservation. Yeah. The children suffer the most. Oh. And the reason why is because they put the children on the front lines to give themselves more opportunities. And the children do get hurt in those situations. So it's just something to consider because to survive something on that heightened of a level is super hard. And that's why for me, I've been out for 12 years now, 12 and a half years. I have fought for 6 years before that to escape. And I also had God in the background of my situation, so I was able to escape it when I did turn on him. And I think about, other people, most of his wives have not left the church. I mean, I think there might be 10 out.
Okay.
Out of 79. And so I'm like, how can you put us in the same category? How can you not see that I've been fighting this when I build a recovery, all this stuff? When people want a blanket statement, take out all the details and just say, well, she was 18, she must have been an accomplice. I've even testified against Warren now, said it before. And one, of course, I'm the only 18-year-old that has done that.
Yeah.
That was married to Warren and stuff. Like the other ones were married to Brielle or whatever. But I'm the only 18-year-old that has done that. And to do all this work out here and to just have a blanket like, well, she was 18, she must have been an accomplice, is very offensive.
Yeah, I'm sure.
To survive that, for one thing, to turn on in a situation with like 70 abusers, because that's like, domestic violence usually has two, and it gets bad enough. And sometimes extended family in polygamy groups when they have 50 family members.
Yeah. I feel like anyone saying that about you has just literally no understanding of nuance or the way the world works. I mean, I'm actually shocked that anyone is even endeavoring to try to make that claim against you, because obviously you've had such a long proven path of trying to get justice, and for yourself and now for others, that I feel like anyone saying that must just be looking to, I don't know what their, you probably know what their angle is better than me, but that just sounds absolutely absurd.
It's just offensive at this point. I'm just like, you don't get anything.
Yeah.
Like, you don't understand literally anything about domestic violence, about abuse, about even escaping. Like, you don't understand. And it's because you probably haven't educated yourself.
Yeah, I think even in just kind of typical domestic abuse situations, the statistic is, I think it takes being kind of six times being abused before the average person will leave the relationship. And that's not when you're in a cult. That's not when you're in you've been kidnapped from your family and taken to a different state and you're being kind of held against your will. Like, I mean, even people who have cell phones and internet and family members still struggle to leave domestic abuse situations.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to, most of the time it's stigma.
Yeah.
When they blanket statement, it's usually just stigma, which is very toxic in my opinion. For any kind of stigma is so toxic. And what I've experienced with education and stigma don't even match up at all.
Yeah.
You think about Mexico and how the stigmas are with them. I'm married to somebody who was from Mexico. I've learned a lot about how it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And stigma is just as toxic in that situation as it is in my situation. Only mine I can talk about because I'm in America and they have family and stuff, so their voice is more silenced.
Oh, wow. I mean, it is all so horrible, and it's kind of crazy that you've been out for so long, and even I'm sure that no matter how long you're out, this will still kind of dominate how your life, which you're kind of doing by choice, which is very, gracious and wonderful of you to now kind of try to go back and help that community, I think. But I'm sure that it's also looking back at your past, hard to wrap your head around. I think we left off at the Yearning for Zion Ranch. You kind of were sharing, you were only there for 4 months. And then where did you go after that? Or was that when Warren Jeffs was arrested?
So I went to Short Creek and I met the mothers who had been left behind, who were crying every day. They weren't mothers who didn't want the children. They were sobbing and praying to be able to be worthy to go where their children were. And so I lived there for about 4 months also. So I was probably still 18 when I went back to Texas, because he told the family in a training that he was going to take them all away from Short Creek and scatter them in these houses of hiding. So they wouldn't be targeted and questioned by the law, because he was already running from the law and all that. They knew he was running from the law. He was very open about when he went on the most wanted list. So he was trying to protect his family, he said. And he was going to scatter them and put caretakers, men over them to watch the house. And he'd put 7 in a regular house that's built out in the world. So I went back there, met those ladies, and then we went back to Texas. He took me back to Texas, but he scattered all the other ladies in different houses. And then when I was in Texas is when the introduction was introduced to me. He said he didn't do it all at the same time. I don't really know how much he's accurate, but I have a feeling that there were so many people in the room that it was hard to know if every one of us were in there. But he said he did teach them all, and he did it all in his time. So I kind of believe every one of them did get the education. And I know who I saw, of course. But also, if you listen to his trainings, which I never have, he names the names of the people in the room at the time, the ones that he's actually targeting. So I don't know how accurate that is. I kind of believe that he is his journals are not written by him. They're written by his favorite wife or whatever. I believe that most of those are pretty accurate. They had to be accurate, or else they wouldn't have even allowed them to go out. They had, she was a scribe. She was like shorthand. Yeah. She had to write fast. She had to, that was her whole job. So like to be an FLDS swimmer and say that was all like fabricated is like,
Yeah, I'm sure it's totally accurate.
And they also use recording devices.
Yeah, I know that there's recordings you can find pretty easily on YouTube. I'll link some below. They're honestly awful to listen to, but it does seem like often he was just recording these interactions.
Somebody who listened to all of those told me, I don't know how accurate that is either, because it wasn't me, but they said that in one of the trainings he does tell the favorite wife to destroy all the evidence, and she didn't have enough time to get it all destroyed by the time, there's so much evidence, by the time the police came in.
Yeah, they really seem to have kept pretty meticulous records, because there's paper documentation, there's a lot of photos, there's audio recordings, there's books, there's ledgers, so I'm sure it was rooms worth of
She got kicked out because it was blamed on her. Oh. So the FLDS blamed her.
Wow. Do you ever talk to her?
I don't. She never reached out to me. I don't really know why. But some of the other ladies do talk to me.
And then, so how did this feed into you beginning? I know you tried to escape over a long period of time. Is this around the point where you started to try to escape?
When I tried to escape was after he was caught. So I did successfully avoid him until he was caught after that introduction. So what I did is I went and told him that I needed to have more time. I just needed to think about it. And he believed my story, and he sent me to a house in hiding. Oh. And then I opened the rebuild. And he kept being nice to me for a while until he got caught. I think it's because he was trying to convince me to come back to Texas. I was open to rebellious in these houses in hiding. So if he was to take me to Texas, where he was, where the elite groups are. So I worked against his own doctrine. And that was what saved me, really, is that he did have God in the background. And everybody, his followers, did want God in the background. Okay. They wanted his interpretation, but still they wanted. So there was a path that I could escape. It didn't always seem that way. There were times when I was really low and stuff because it was so consistent, abuse. But there was a little bit of hope. Where I do believe, in some of these other cases, I don't know enough about movies and stuff. I don't think that's a hope path. But when I was in Texas, I wanted to mention that I did see people crying. I did see people being yelled at, told they had to stay. So I do believe there were more people trying to fight after the introduction, but they weren't allowed to. The peer pressure was so great. There were so many people who just went along with it. They were pulled back in. And part of the biggest catch, I think, was when he did bring the mothers that had given birth. He'd already traumatized them to such a level, taking them away from their kids. And now he finally brings them to Texas, and they have to choose between leaving their little kids, 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds, or abusing 12-year-olds that are not their kids. So it's like a total trafficking situation where, even though God is in the background, it's almost more detrimental sometimes when you're out of the church, especially. Because then you have to navigate a little differently because it's always in your mind. PTSD is big for me. But at the time, it did save my life to have some of these adult people not fight because they want to protect their kids on the property, and it also creates a whole peer pressure setting where the mothers that don't have any kids, a lot of times they just identify with it. They don't want to fight. I do believe if you were to go to court nowadays, a lot of them would get out of it because they had a guard tower, a gate, and all of that, where trafficking is forced part of coercion, even as an adult. And you can prove it pretty easy in these cases, where in the Sam Bateman case, where he was just given 50 years, he was a guy who became a prophet after Warren. Right. He had to live all the doctrine that Warren taught, as well as added doctrine. He was caught, but he did it right in Short Creek. So the wives can't prove it as well. They can't prove they're forced into it. Maybe they were threatened. I don't know. Probably most likely because of like ritualistic abuse, even subconsciously it's a threat, even if just being there is a threat. And a lot of times they don't get a chance to express why they're there.
It does seem like Warren Jeffs made it so that the stakes of leaving was so high that so few people were willing to, and kind of throughout your whole life, you've just gone along with it. You've gone along with it. You've gone along with it. So then when some huge bomb gets dropped, you just still go along with it because if you don't, you'll lose everything. And you've just practiced this muscle in your brain your whole life of just saying, I'm just going to go along with it. And it's kind of led down this path of just so many people willing to put up with or contribute to these atrocities. And then you have the added layer of, but God is telling him we should do this. So that means what's bad is actually good because God is on our side.
Yeah, I think a lot of them have woke up now that they probably shouldn't have been brought in more times. And maybe they even did at that time and didn't dare stand up like you're saying.
Yeah.
But like either way, like I feel like so many of them are still fighting for that cause because they need it to be true, even if they know it's not a good cause. They need it to be true now because they've been brought in too many times and they don't think the world wants them, where he's told them the world doesn't want them and stuff. They don't know if they can prove, they'd rather just have it be true. But like the thing is like for me, when I fought against him, I fought for the kids. I didn't have children of my own. I wasn't in a position to say what some of them are able to say. And for me, I couldn't even do what he wanted me to because it was too outrageous. I felt bad for the kids. I felt like nobody's protecting these little kids. Like that doesn't work for me. When I fought and fought and fought and fought, it was years of fighting. And I couldn't turn around at some point because I had fought for so long that even if I thought about like saving some of what I was, like finding a cause in there, or if I wanted to just fit in, blend in, there was no way to blend in after some point.
Yeah.
Because it was just too obvious. He put me on a pedestal and said, if you turn on me, this is how you're going to be treated. For me, I was like, I believe I was the most hated wife by him. I don't know about everybody, but by him, because I turned on him. You think about it, I was only like 20 years old, Yeah.
A 20-year-old woman who's up against an entire cult's worth of people. I mean, you were incredibly brave and continue to be. I mean, people sometimes will be like, oh, Alyssa, how do you make these videos? And I'm like, I feel like the Mormon church is so mainstream and normal. It's just like walking in a park compared to what ex-FLDS people, and, for you even more so because you are so tied into the very heart of this religion that it is, I am in awe of you. And I'm sure that to be fighting against it while still in it, especially that you were speaking out against it, but still not being permitted to walk away. You're basically being imprisoned and saying like, this is wrong.
And it was like my health was targeted so bad. I feel like that's good to point out. I think in domestic violence, health gets targeted subtly. People don't always realize that it's a big deal to have your health questioned. And if you're not in a safe environment, it's not a good solution. Because when you go to the doctor, a lot of times they'll just automatically say, have you been sleeping at night? Which is not the first question. It is, are you safe? Because if you're not safe, you're not going to be sleeping. Even if you think you're not safe and you are, it's still not a solution. You have to feel safe.
Yeah.
Whether you're safe or not, there's two factors. You have to feel safe, whether you are safe or not. The biggest thing is if somebody comes in and says, I don't feel safe, that's a red flag. You don't say, are you sleeping at night? You say, are you safe? If you don't feel safe, I need to believe you anyway.
That's definitely question number one, or should be question number one, seems.
And if they don't feel safe, that should be something to listen to, because you might be safe and not feel safe. So if you don't feel safe, that's actually probably the better question. Do you feel safe? And if you feel safe, then that is good. But if you don't feel safe, then even if it's not true, they should still believe it. They should still try to help them feel safe.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like maybe the next point to focus on is the day that Warren Jeffs got arrested, because it seems like that was another huge pivotal moment for, I'm sure, for the community, but also in your story. What was that day like?
So the day he got arrested, I was waiting for that day. Because when I went and became openly rebellious, I couldn't like leave. If I prayed, if I, because I had caretakers watching cameras, like I didn't feel like I could fight my way out until he was caught. Because I was afraid of being brought back to Texas. So I was kind of waiting for that day. He already told us he was on the most wanted list. So I was kind of just hoping that would happen. And when it did happen, then I was excited, but I didn't tell anyone. I remember thinking, like, everybody ran out of the room crying and stuff. And I was just like, this is my chance.
Yeah.
So I did walk out of the room, tried to act sad, but like I went into my room, I was just so excited. So I'm like thinking I can finally start to plan my escape. I didn't realize he was going to turn really mean. But I think what happened was that he decided he had lost his opportunity to have pull me in as a full accomplice. So before that, he was trying to like convince me by being nice to force me in some ways, but like also convince me to come back to Texas to pray, to be obedient so he could bring me with the elite people. Well, when I didn't try and he got caught, he's like, I can never make her a full accomplice. Because like in the court of law, if you don't agree to it, if you're brought into something, it's like a first, wake up call. And if you keep going back, it's like, okay, whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or in my case, I didn't keep going back.
Mm-hmm.
So he felt threatened by me. So he actually turned really sour. He started sending people to surround me that would hurt me, like would psychologically try to at least hurt me. Most of the time when it started, it was among his own wives. And I think a part of that was people who didn't see me in those groups and were mad at me for not being there and wanted to be me at some point, but didn't know how to backtrack. The jealousy was so high. And at first I didn't realize it was so bad. And then later I remember waking up to it, like, there's people in this world who are never going to be nice. And they want to kill me. I remember crying and just saying, they just want to kill me. And they're going to kill me if I don't get an exit route. So he was surrounding me with people like that. He had the say of who lived in our houses, what caretakers we got. The thing about the caretakers, though, was they were men. So he started with the introduction with his own wives. I don't know how many trainings he had with other families or if he did that. I kind of think he did in the temple. I never went into the temple. I left before the temple was built. He was in prison. So he had to use other families, obviously, to take me out or whatever he was going to do. And usually he'd want a caretaker to do that because they're a man, and they have access to hunting guns and, different things. For me, I would ask them questions because they had God in the background. So I was able to negotiate to some level, the doctrine says that if you kill somebody that is innocent, then you would be shedding innocent blood. Or Warren Jeffs was trying to say it was just and that I had committed a crime and that it was a just death, so it would be like blood atonement. I was trying to say what crime is high enough for blood atonement, and in our church it was dating. Dating is the one that's high enough because of the appointed marriage and purity and all of that stuff. The only way to be pure was to go through the leader, which I had. So they were all like, well, did you date anyone? So they'd search my past for dating. When they couldn't find anything, they would freak out. They were like, well, we don't dare do this because if anything goes wrong, we would be held accountable in heaven.
So they were basically actively looking for a doctrinal excuse to kill you.
Yeah. And they did it, they would do it for months and then, ask me questions every day, and then when they couldn't find anything, they'd go to Warren Jeffs. I don't know what was said each time, but he would transfer me to another caretaker and start over. Wow. And so I would never get a break. They were getting breaks, but I was definitely getting worse in there with my health. And he wanted it that way. He didn't want people to believe me. He wanted to make it so I was drugged at some point when I was 23, from 23 to 26. I was highly drugged, slowly, but what
were they do you know what they were giving you?
They were giving me Seroquel, which is a really high medication psychotic. It's like a mood stabilizer or something. They use it for bipolar and maybe some other things, but they told me it was for sleeping. They didn't tell me. I didn't initially have an interview with a doctor before they gave it to me. Wow. And I didn't know if I was going to wake up after I took it, but I was in South Dakota at the time in their compound there. I didn't have an exit route, so I took it. And, it was a mild dose at first. They upped it over time, every time that I would try to escape or every time I would.
Oh, my God.
be found contemplating escaping or anything like that. When I made it back to Short Creek, because I did have a really big trial attempt to escape, and they sent me back to Short Creek to investigate my parents, who are still in Short Creek, who never went to the elite groups. From there, they had never had all this education about how to, psychologically hurt people. So I felt like a breath of air, fresh air, when I got back to Short Creek, even though I had my experiences with them that weren't all good, and they had been like capitalized on. I want more than just family. I still felt like they didn't understand. So I was like coming back from military almost, where I was like really heightened on my own awareness, but the other people around me were just like, we don't get it. Wow. My father actually went to the bishop, who was Lyle, Warren's brother at the time in Short Creek, and asked him what they did to his daughter, because she wasn't the same. Because I was definitely way more alert. I wasn't shy anymore. I was fighting every day with trying to figure out how to solve issues. That just wasn't how I was before. He asked him what they did to his daughter. She's not the same person. And he said, it's none of your business.
That's so wild.
But I did stay with my family for about 2 years. And it wasn't all because I wanted to just hurry and leave. I didn't exactly know where to go, but I also didn't look actively the whole time. My main goal when I got to Short Creek was to protect the children. That was my main goal when I went to Texas. So what I thought is, like, if I use the system that I've been taught, which is the FLDS system, it would be to turn in all the people who abused me, because Warren Jeffs was behind it, but he still had accountability to God, and to like his members and stuff. So like if I turned all the people in that abused me, then he probably would act. I figured he would act because I know him pretty well. He acts under his own system. He doesn't always agree with it, but he will act. So I thought, if I turn them all in, then maybe they'll get corrected, all the people who abused me, and they'll have to retrain adults, and it will give the children a breath of fresh air to be able to think and stuff in the meantime. That was the most I could do before I thought they would target me for doing that. And I didn't know if I'd survive that, but I thought, if I do survive, then I can get on the outside and maybe do some more work later. So I actually did turn them all in after 2 years, because I didn't do it immediately because I knew I wouldn't survive. They would know it was. So I waited some time, turned them all in. All of them showed up in Short Creek the same week that I turned them in. And they all got one correction. So if they were like a bishop, they lost one position. If they were like only had a family, they lost their family. Like, it was a big deal. And there was more people who got corrected. I don't understand why he chose who he did. But like, for me, I was scared. And that's when I got locked up in my brother's house. And I believe he was threatened also. But when I escaped out the window, I almost didn't escape, obviously. So that's a whole long story in and of itself. Like, when I went to activist, I went to a family first who was in town. That was obviously FLDS, that I knew where they lived. I ran through a yard, and a lady, so there was a lot of miracles that day that led to like me actually being able to escape, because I had tried a lot of times where one link missing I was so heightened alert that one link missing would mess it up. It was basically my last try anyway. I learned a lot from the other attempts, so I didn't take the main roads. I took the back roads. I ran to this family. A lady was sitting out in her backyard meditating right before the house I was running to. She actually asked me if I needed help, and I told her yes. She drove me up to the house I was going to, and she's like, should I go in? Should I just leave? And I thought, you might as well come in. And she knew the numbers of the activists, but the family I was running to didn't know them. And then the family I ran to actually did drive me to the activists by the end of the day.
Oh, wow.
And then like the next day, the police went through the town, put me on the missing list. There were FLDS police, a lot of them, and took a picture of me, asking where I went, located the organization that had me, and was told that I was okay.
Were you afraid that they would figure out how to actually get you back from?
They were trying to bring me back because they were telling him, my biological mother was telling him that she had custody of me, guardianship over me because of my mental state, which wasn't actually true. So when she told the activist that had me that she had custody of me, she's like, you need to show me that paperwork. And they never called her back because they didn't have the paperwork.
Okay.
They had my hospital records because they had cult doctors that were giving me the medicine.
Wow.
But they didn't have my signature on them. And I was 26 years old.
So basically they were claiming kind of that you were her custody legally, and you didn't have the decision-making ability to leave and be with the activists.
Yeah, to be out of the church. I couldn't survive without my biological mother.
Wow.
But that was sneaking up on me the whole time. That's why I like to point that out, is because like in domestic violence, that happens. And people don't always realize it's coming. That if you don't recognize it, you can't stop it.
Yeah.
They target your health so that they can have control over you in the end. And if you don't recognize it, you might give them that control without even meaning to.
Interesting.
Or for me, I woke up to it right at the very end, because I met people in Short Creek that had that. When I was hanging out and stuff, I met people in Short Creek that did have that happen to them. They were legally signed over to a guardian, and they could never. So for me, I was worried about that.
Wow.
And it didn't actually happen before I left. So I knew that was my last chance to try. And I did fight really, really hard to make so that I would look for clues. Like I ended up in a domestic violence shelter because of some of the stuff. Like, so when the police were looking for me, then I was at the activist's house, but like they got a hold of her number. So it scared me because they can track you through her number. So I ended up going to a domestic violence shelter. Then I had different activists in Salt Lake that were helping me at the time. I had her too, but like I had ones that were local. And they showed up with like my ID. They went back to my parents. I was traumatized by that because they told me I was going to sign some paperwork, and then they didn't have me sign paperwork. So I actually went into a PTSD episode where I kind of disassociated, and they ended up taking me to the hospital. And when I went to the hospital, then I demanded, when I started to get better, I demanded to go to a certain domestic violence shelter in Salt Lake that had a lot of high security. They didn't really want me because they probably were wondering if my abusers know where I was. And it's risky for everybody in the building if your abuser knows you're there.
Yeah.
But when I was in the hospital, my biological mother called me. She left a message and saying, it was a month after I left. She's like, I'm in Salt Lake, and she's leaving a message at my hospital saying she cares. She didn't have my alias to actually talk to me, but like I was just like, what? Like some of that stuff is red flags. So when I got into the shelter I was going to, I actually went to the case manager, who's assigned to everybody. Everybody in the shelter should have a case manager, and I showed her some of the evidence that I had. She kind of freaked out. She was like, okay, we're going to go and help you anyway. Because the reason why they took me into that shelter was because the activists convinced him I had a plane ticket to fly out in 1 week, which they did have. But I didn't go on the airplane because I didn't trust those activists anymore because they had broken my confidence. So she dropped all the activists that were helping me, went to some different organizations. I ended up making it to Tennessee with the help of the other organizations.
Wow.
And I changed my whole identity, went through basically witness protection in Tennessee. It took me 2 years to do that also. Did my GED in the meantime, then ended up not being able to pay my rent the month so I was on SSI because I got on that first because of my PTSD.
I mean, I can't imagine, because at that point, Warren Jeffs was still such a high profile story that having one of his wives in a hospital I'm sure that these people were not equipped to kind of comprehend just what that meant potentially. I'm sure they knew who Warren Jeffs was, but it sounds like they weren't able to help you in the way you needed just because you were connected to this ultra now infamous person who had, I think people also don't realize that the FLDS, especially probably back then more so, are kind of everywhere in Utah, like living in a lot of communities. It just sounds like a really scary situation for you, and like they weren't able to help you potentially in the way you needed.
Well, they actually told me not to be out on the road because I didn't have a car, obviously. I never saw money. So to plan my escape was one of the things that came up in the whole thing. I'm like, how do I plan an escape when you never see a dime? There was a lot of things that came up, especially after I had got more out. I couldn't ride a bus because they would find me on the roads. They were searching the roads for me. They did kidnap another ex-FLDS person off the streets and brought him back during the time frame that I escaped. Some of that stuff was just so much, but that's why I went to Tennessee, because it was safer.
Yeah. And is that where you kind of started to it sounds like you got your GED. That sounds like where your life, you kind of started to move forward?
Yeah, and I had I met Christians for the first time. I loved them. I had a lot of activists that were helping me. When they changed my social security number, they didn't change my SSI in the same month, so I couldn't pay my rent. And I was devastated by that. So I called my attorney who in Utah who had helped me do this because he knew how to do it with FLDS people. And he said, but I had this man who was ex-FLDS and kicked out as a boy, went to college, graduated. He just graduated pilot school. He came in and he gave me some airplane tickets that he said, if anybody's in crisis, tell them to fly home because Short Creek is changing from FLDS to ex-FLDS. So I was like, you want me to fly home? That's just crazy. All this stuff.
You're like, I tried so hard to escape that place. Man.
So I ended up going and calling, I found a lady in Salt Lake that would accommodate my situation. I'd pay her later when the paperwork went through. And we didn't know how long it'd be either. Just whenever it happened, we'd pay her. And she ended up taking me in. So I did fly back. I went to Salt Lake first. But eventually I reconnected with my little brothers. I had left the church by this time. He was getting married in Short Creek at my father's house that he had gone and collected after he was kicked out. So I ended up going to his wedding, and I remember my adopted mom, because so the activists that I originally met in the beginning, I reconnected with when I went to Tennessee. There was 3 activists. One of them was crying every day and hoping that she could be in my life again. So I did reconnect with her, and she sat in the car. She became my adopted mom, but she sat in the car during that wedding just to be sure that I was safe and stuff like that. My first time back in Short Creek. When I was told about the house, I was among ex-FLDS people in Salt Lake anyway. I felt like that I should go after it and hopefully do what we have done with the dream, create a recovery center. It's so needed. It's been needed for generations. I had rights to the house, being one of Warren Jeff's ex-wives, where the rules of the landowners here were set up by Warren Jeff, but then they were taken over by ex-FLDS people. So they made their own rules, which were basically, we'll give the titles back to the people who built the houses or wives of the people who built the houses. Warren Jeff was obviously not going to get the house.
Yeah.
I've had Mormons, ex-Mormons come to me and say this has been needed for generations, a house like this.
Yeah.
And you pulled it up, comments like that are so encouraging to me. Because it's to some level true, but it wasn't just me. It was the whole community realized the same need and did give me that chance at least to go after it. So they awarded me the house in November of 2016. So I was applied in February of 2016. They awarded me the house on Thanksgiving Day in November, and we found the Dream Center. They're a worldwide organization. They started in LA. They have one in Phoenix. So the Phoenix group is the one that decided to reach out to Short Creek. The directors there worked in the Phoenix Dream Center for a long time before they became the directors in Short Creek.
Yeah, and I actually, for anyone watching, I got to go to the Dream Center when I went down to Short Creek about, I guess, I don't know, what, 4 or 5 months ago, and it's such a beautiful, to take something that was once Warren Jeff's home and turn it into a place for people who need help and are trying to rebuild their lives is real. And you guys have so many resources there. You have counseling, places for people to stay, beautiful meals, a garden in the backyard. It's really just a beautiful, it's really an oasis, I think. And so it's so cool, not just that you were able to do it, but find this awesome organization to partner with so you could bring in all these professionals. And it's really an amazing place and resource. And if you're watching and you would like to donate, I will put a link to the Dream Center below so that you can actually donate yourself to this organization, because it's doing really fantastic work. And I think it's such really just a beautiful part of your story that you've gone through all of this, but now that you're able to and willing to turn around and help all these people who also still need the help that you're now able to provide, and your team. Do you have any final message that you'd like to share about your experience, or what you'd like people to understand about what you've learned in your entire life? Just, I don't know, that's not very well worded, but any final message for the audience that you'd like to share?
I usually say, like, really, like, one of my, I have a few of them, but like one of the main ones is like, what you use to survive, you may not use to thrive. And I use that because, like, I had to use to survive. I had to use some of the skills were like the doctrine, what God in the background, their God in the background, because that's what everybody wanted to hear. But I don't use that a lot now. There's a lot of things that I do use, like, like awareness and stuff, discernment, that's a heightened one for me. My therapist says I walk in a room and I see 20 things automatically that other people don't see, just because that's what I was trained to do. But it's just one of those things that, like, I feel like it's not always the case. And if you go in and think I survived, I've done it all, that's just really not usually the case.
Interesting.
You do have to learn how to thrive on the outside.
That's a really beautiful quote. I've never heard that quote before. What you use to survive. Say it one more time.
What you use to survive, you may not need to thrive.
Wow. That's really profound. And especially for leaving high demand religions, high control groups, you really have to relinquish a lot of your, some of these things. I think similarly for Mormonism, stuff that you held closely in order to understand how to move through the world, and then you realize it's really maybe hindering you or holding you back from fully living life once you've left that part of yourself or taken away those negative you're removed from the situation, but your brain is still the same, and you have to kind of reforge the way that you view the world. So I love that. That's super profound, and thank you for sharing. Thank you again to Brielle for agreeing to be interviewed. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone has really learned from her story. I learned so much, and I feel like you're so brave in everything that you've accomplished, and I really encourage anyone watching to consider donating to the Dream Center if you can. It's one way that you can really support and help people who are like Brielle, who are leaving these situations, who need basic resources. They need some maybe mental health help, whatever it is. The Dream Center really aims to provide it, and it's a beautiful space that's been reclaimed from a really awful situation. And so consider donating. And if you want to learn more about Brielle's story, I definitely recommend checking out some of the links that I'll put below. She's been featured in HBO and a lot of other resources, TEDx, etc., that I would definitely recommend checking out. Thank you again, Brielle, for joining us. And as always, I will see you all next week.